We've got a number of messages in from people around the region. Julian Spindler has got a note from Tim Page, who's one of Neil's old friends. They first met in Vientiane. Jonathan's got a message from Neil Kelly, who is now 91, still going incredibly strong, covered the Algerian Civil War, if I'm not mistaken.
He was a Bren gunner in the Second World War.
Bren gunner in the Second World War. Anyway, he's still, you wouldn't believe he was more than 60 to look at him. And I have a message in here from John Macbeth, who was there on the morning. You'll see him on the footage that's coming up. If you just follow the emails that are floating around, the sort of depth of emotion that surrounds Neil Kelly, Neil Davis and Bill Latch and their terrible deaths is enormous, and it's still bleeding 30 years later. So anyway, this is a note from John Macbeth. Thank you, FCCT, for letting me say a few words about a close friend who will forever remain etched in my memory. Some of you here may not know who he was. Not the Neil Davis killed in a senseless coup on September 9th, 1985, but Neil Davis, the man, and yes, the legend. I'm sure Derek and Klaus will share with you many of the memories that will help you understand why we place him in a pantheon of his own. The day of Neil's funeral was the saddest day of my life. In the tearful eulogy I delivered at Christchurch that morning, I said when Neil was born they had thrown away the mould. Obviously, there have been others who have shown the same courage as Neil in tight situations. For me, however, there was a lot more to him than that. In the days when younger journalists actually still listened to their peers, Neil would sit down with newcomers to Thailand and spend a couple of hours briefing them on Indochina and Thailand and giving them tips on how to function in an unfamiliar environment. His generosity had no bounds, nor did his love for the ladies. Make no mistake, Neil may have been a combat cameraman, but he was also the consummate correspondent with his own wide circle of contacts and an intimate knowledge of Cambodia in particular. He even wrote for the Far Eastern Economic Review in the early 1970s, discovering very early what the Khmer Rouge were capable of. Remarkable for me was his ability to develop a rapport with Asian officials, on one occasion compelling an enraged Thai army officer to transfer his .45 automatic to his left hand so he could shake Neil's outstretched hand. He showed that disarming side of himself in Saigon in 1975, greeting communist troops with a wave and a smile as they stormed into the presidential palace. I find it amazing that in the world's first televised war, it was an Australian cameraman and not one of the hordes of American newsmen who filmed its last act. Remember, of course, he much preferred being in the field with Vietnamese and Cambodian units during the 11 years he covered the conflict. I have not forgotten Bill and would hate you to think that I am treating him as a postscript. But he was different, a quieter family man married to a Northeast Thai who didn't indulge in some of the excesses, our excesses, he says. Neil was killed instantly. Bill was wounded initially. His wound was undiscovered, but it had hit the liver and a fragment from a machine gun round had ricocheted off the pavement. His death hours later in hospital shocked us all because it was so unexpected. It reminded us of Neil's oft-expressed concern that he was now responsible for a soundman wherever he went. In Vietnam and Cambodia, he filmed alone with a bell and howl and didn't have to worry about anyone else. Both should have lived to be old men. Neil would have been 81 today. He would have come to my 60th and 70th birthdays when we drank away too much and retold the old stories. Those of us who are still around were damn lucky to have lived through those years and to have enjoyed the friendship of people like Neil, Derek, and the late Rodney Tasker, Paul Lockyer, and Barry Wayne, and so many others. I won't ramble on, but I have a lighter story I thought I would share with you. Neil was the first to discover that my wife-to-be, Yuli Ishmartono, and I were an item. Yuli's a past president, by the way. 2 days before his death, a large group of us from the FCCT attended some sort of foreign ministry seminar at a hotel in Cha'am. While Yuli and I had been assigned separate rooms, we secretly shared hers during the overnight stay. Well, I thought it was a secret. In the morning, I got up early and scurried back to my room. I was busy trying to make it appear I had slept in my bed when Neil burst in and exclaimed, "Gotcha, boy." I don't know how he knew, but the bugger had been lying in wait for me. When he was killed the next morning, an hour or so after I passed him on the street, I'm ashamed to say that at one point I thought that with everything that had been going on since dawn, he wouldn't have had time to spread the news. Wrong. As I was to discover, every man and his dog knew. I will be thinking of you tonight. As I write this, I can feel that old familiar emotional tug I always feel when I think of Neil, which I often do for reasons I can't really explain. In many ways, his death spelt the end of an era, with members of our tightly knit group all going their separate ways. Perhaps it is that and the salad days of journalism which I mourn for as well. So that's John Macbeth in Jakarta. Neil Kelly?
Thank you, Dominic. It's quite remarkable to look at Neil Davis in that documentary and to remember what a remarkable skill it is to be a frontline cameraman. I've worked with a number. To be a good one is an incredible skill. It requires that kind of incredible calm, that ability to observe and take in everything around you. It's a very, very unique talent and very special. I was rather amused actually at John Macbeth's comments there about young journalists being willing to listen, because when I started in Jakarta in the beginning of 1996, Macbeth was the old hand there, and he did not suffer fools gladly and used to tell all of us who were just starting that we had to do what he called the hard yards. Macbeth by then, grizzled, missing a leg, drinking as well as the best of them and writing as well as he ever has. Neil Kelly, I remember from my days back when I worked in the BBC in Bush House and World Service, when he was the BBC's stringer in Thailand. We didn't have a bureau here then, and Neil used to fill in whenever Thai stories popped up, which they did now and again. So his name's a very familiar one. Clearly, Neil Davis and Bill Latch meant a great deal to him. He's written here, Neil Davis and Bill Latch brought expertise and distinction to the Bangkok-based Foreign Press Corps in the 1970s and 80s, and also a great deal of fun and good-hearted mischief. Neil had high repute around the world. He'd earned that with professionalism, daring, and rare courage. I don't think any of us who saw that film could dispute that. Bill was a generation younger, a student of history of East Asia. He knew Thai politics better than, and society better than most. He had a keen nose for the news and a talent for putting a handle on the story very quickly and accurately. And he spoke and read Thai better than any other foreign journalist or diplomat I encountered at that time. It was a privilege and a pleasure to work alongside Bill and Neil. They were the most generous of colleagues. I will never forget the friendship and help they gave me. Nor will I forget those responsible for ending their lives, the murderers who were never called to account.
Right, well, I should introduce our other guests. We have Klaus Bratt, who was there on the day, long-time veteran, and we have Pai San, who was the president of the Foreign Correspondents Club in 84 and 85, and had to deal with this very traumatic business. He was the bureau chief for Far East Economic Review, one of the most daring journalists of his day. He was one of the first people to write about the Crown Property Bureau seriously, and that's a very long time ago. Do you remember that? I don't want to be too maudlin because we're celebrating the lives, and I'm going to ask Julian Spindler to talk to present Tim Page's material a little bit later. But we were talking about younger journalists, and I think it would be appropriate tonight to remember that Bill Latch and Neil Davis were not the only journalists that have been killed in Thailand. And it's something that's been debated at the board for about 2 years now, and I think we're in the final stages of putting up a memorial plaque to foreign journalists who've lost their lives in Thailand. And it goes back to 1974. Claudia Ross, who was an American journalist working for the Bangkok Post, was murdered, and her death has never been properly explained, but there's a strong suspicion it was related to her very daring investigative journalism at the time. She was breaking a lot of new boundaries, covering sensitive issues. A Christian religious cult was blamed for it, but it's debatable who did it. But she was murdered, and I think the belief is it was to do with her work. Then we had Bill Latch and Neil Davis, who were both killed on September 9th, which we know about. A less remembered victim was a correspondent called Lance Motley, who was working for the American magazine Soldier of Fortune, which is an interesting publication to say the least. And he was killed in May 1989. He was actually blown up by a landmine inside Burma in Komura, or Wangkau, which was a Karen camp just near Mysot. But he actually died in Thailand about 3 hours later. And then sadly, coming forward, we've learnt no lessons, and it happened again on April the 10th, 2010. Hiro Muramoto, the Japanese cameraman for Reuters, was killed in demonstrations in Bangkok, and arrived and clearly didn't realize how serious the situation was, how quickly things turn very dangerously in Thailand, as we're going to see with some footage shortly. And then finally, a month later, on May 19th, Fabio Palenghi, an Italian freelance journalist, photographer, was killed very close by on Rajdamneri. And he got himself in the wrong place in front of military bullets, basically. So, as I said, I don't want to be too maudlin, but it's a pretty depressing subject, and it's not going to get better in the next 20 minutes. What I'd like to do, Eric is over there, is run the footage. But first, I think, Klaus, can you read your material, because it actually sets the scene. You were there on the morning.
Yeah.
And
we got a call from UPI early in the morning that there was a coup underway, and headed out to Rajdamneri, and I was with Seni Monkon, who some of you would remember, and Mabuchi, I don't remember who he was working with. We were covering the story for ABC. We went up to Rajdamneri, and at the equestrian statue in front of the old parliament, we ran into Neil and Bill. They weren't in a very good mood. I don't know specifically why, but we all knew that they weren't happy campers. They were both independent guys, and because of new technology, they were forced to work together. The new video cameras required a big tape recorder that had to be carried by the sound guy, and they were tied together by
a long cable.
A long, heavy cord. It was clunky. It was very clunky. And they were both independent guys. Bill was a radio reporter. Neil always worked alone. The company required them to work together. So nothing much was going on in front of the Supreme Command. We chatted for a while and then headed our separate ways looking for action. After a while, some tanks pulled out in front of the Supreme Command, and crowds started to build. Some army trucks pulled up in Siyutia Road, and the soldiers started waving them away. They didn't leave, and the tanks started to fire. The crowd panicked. There was a brief panic, and people scrambled, running up Rajdamneri. Seni and I, we crouched behind a tree. We didn't feel particularly threatened. And when the firing died down, we went to our car to get our mobile phone, which was a huge old thing in a briefcase, to call the office. And that's when we found out that Neil had been injured. At first, we heard that he had been hit. And only some hours later, we learned that he had been killed. We only learned that Bill had died that evening when we were feeding our story from Channel 7. It wasn't supposed to be like that. As foreign journalists in Thailand, unlike in Cambodia and Vietnam, we always felt relatively safe covering stories here. That sort of naivete disappeared that day. We never felt targeted, certainly. What happened really shook us all a great deal. And it made some conflicts surface that we weren't very happy.
No, it was. I think everybody and the entire press corps was so shook up that week because they were killed, and then there was a period of mourning as everybody got everything organized. And the NBC foreign editor Jerry Lamprecht flew in, and I just remember the ABC Australia correspondent Jeff Leach and his wife Sandy were a tower of strength, because we all had to go down to the police morgue down the road here and dress Neil for the funeral, which is not fun, whether it's your good friend. And on the day of the funeral, there was a memorial service first, which you'll probably see in the video, at Christchurch on Convent Road. And then in the afternoon, we all moved over to the temple for the cremation. And on a light-hearted note, I have to say that the audience at the cremation really showed how Neil was truly loved, because, quite frankly, it was nearly 80% women, many of them foreign diplomats' wives, lots of ties, everything from go-go girls to businesswomen. It was the entire spectrum of Thai society and foreign society. The women were weeping. So I think, if any, I just remember looking around and thinking, wow, what a send-off. I mean, he'd be proud of that.
Hey, San, do you want to set the scene, or do you want to talk after we've seen the footage?
Yeah, if you allow me to say a few words.
Yeah, of course.
On the big picture of covering situations of conflict. I think that it's a fact of life for those of us who used to cover such situations to know fully well that there's always an element of risk, an element of danger involved, you know. I mean, you try to determine as far as you can go in trying to get as close as possible to the scenes of action. At the same time, you try to ensure that you are adequately protected, you know, or that you run the least chance of getting hurt. You try to strike a fine line, you know, and how you operate in such situations. Now, how do you manage? I suppose you rely on your natural instinct, and then to a larger part, maybe you also rely on your experience. You know, on that basis, I think that the tragic incident that happened to Neil Davis on that day was very unfortunate. I mean, Neil, as we have seen in the film, Frontline just now, was probably one of the finest war correspondents, if not the finest. I mean, for him, who has gone through, I mean, the much more dangerous situations, much more dangerous combat scenes, you know, in Vietnam and also in Cambodia. I mean, to have lost his life in Bangkok, I mean, that's quite unfortunate. I think at the end of the day, there's some element of luck involved also. I mean, we here in this part of the world, we believe in luck, you know. I think that maybe, perhaps, Neil was a little bit unlucky to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, you know. He should not have been killed. I mean, with his experience, you know. What happened at the time was tanks were firing on the 1st Army Division radio station, a short distance from the Raw Plaza, from the headquarters of the Supreme Command, where most of the reporters were. And Neil and his soundman Bill Latch, and also Gary Burns, 3 of them, I think, were taking cover opposite of this 1st Army Division station, filming that one of the tanks firing on the station. Why did the tank fire on the station? Because the coup makers didn't have full control. They set out at about 3 o'clock in the morning. And the first thing they did, like most other coup makers in Thailand, was to seize control of the PRD, the headquarters of the Radio Thailand, of all the mass media, nerve centers. Second place, they went to MCOT, MCOT, Channel 9, and also a lot of radio stations, state-owned, And then they tried to seize control of government-run, military-run stations, which were not on their side. These were rebels. They staged a coup on the day when the PM, himself a former army commander, Prem Tinsulanonda, was away on an official visit to Indonesia. And the army commander at the time, Thich Kam Ek, was also away on the visit to, I think, West Germany. So they seized that sort of vacuum to try to take over. Did they have a good agenda for Thailand? I would say no. I mean, over the years, we heard these Young Turks. I mean, the coup leader was Colonel Mandor Rukajan, a key leader of the so-called Young Turks, young officer, colonel, mostly colonel officers in the Thai army. I mean, they talk. Sometimes they talk about the need to improve the lots of the poor farmers in this country, improve the lot of the rural peasants. And they talk about something that smacks of socialism, but I think they didn't have any clear agenda. They didn't have any clear ideals or political ideologies. I mean, at the end of the day, it boils out, as far as I could see, just a simple matter of power grabbing. The army at the time was very factionalized. The Young Turks being graduates from class 7, class 8 of the Chulajom Krao Academy, that's the most prestigious military academy in Thailand, was one big faction. The main rivals were the class 5 graduates, a few years their senior, whose leader, Suchinda Krapayun, a few years later staged another coup successfully and became Prime Minister briefly. So it's a lot of, many cliques, many groups, many factions in the army trying to fight against each other. There were also the so-called Tahan Prachatipatai, the so-called democratic soldiers. So I think at the end of the day, they were just fighting each other, try to seize control and become, powerful. So I think on hindsight, it was a very tragic incident and something which should not have happened. But then again, we in this part of in Thailand, we believe in we say karma, luck, So I think our friend Neil Davis has made a lot of merits in his life, though. A lot of lady friends and good friends like us. But he had used all of his merits, and he had to go. Thank you.
That's excellent background. So just to remind you, what you're seeing is outside the 1st Army Division King's Guard radio station on Sri Ayutthaya Road. That's where the action took place. And the context of the footage that you're going to see is, as Paisan mentioned, the coup had taken place earlier in the morning. The government had lost the Radio Thailand broadcasting, and this army station was the government station answering to the command. And it continued to broadcast, and it would not stop, and it was networking on the radio for the Navy, the military, and getting them to retransmit it. So the Young Turks, the colonels in charge, were exasperated with the station, and the order came through, obliterate it, which you're about to see the secretary. Prem was out of the country. Thich Kam Ek, the commander-in-chief,
Didn't Prem take the royal family up to Kurat? Or
no, that was the wrong coup.
Wrong coup?
Wrong coup.
That was 81.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Wrong coup.
Klaus
Okay,
Rath and
sorry.
we were running back and forth Bangkok and Korat.
April Fool's
That's
Day
the April
coup.
Fool's coup.
Sorry.
So just one last
Getting
thing.
old.
No, it's very confusing, and as Derek points out, there were 2 failed coups in 81, 85. Paisan will tell you that all the academics and expert advisors said, Thailand's beyond coups. We don't have them all. And look at where we're sitting now. We've had 3 that have gone through since this failed coup. But anyway, the command was held by General Tieng Chai Sisampan, who was the deputy to Artit. He was the man that faced down the coup. He was backed by Chevalit Yongchayut, Pichik Gunavanit, Israpong Lumpakdi, and Suchinda Krapayun, who was the director of operations. So it's a whole group of very familiar military names, some of whom were to return very successfully with their own coup in 1991, but that's another story. So, can we have the footage? And what I'll try and point out a few way markers and let you see a few point a few things out that you shouldn't miss. And I should also warn you that there are two sections in this that are very unhappy, but there's no point discussing it and not showing it. I mean, there's the death of Neil, obviously, to the aftermath of that, and there's a scene in the church that's very, with Bill Latch, which is extremely sad. But anyway, we'll roll with it. Look away if you can't take it. So this is footage of the morning. This would be about probably about 10 a.m. and you're about to see a shot of John Macbeth walking in front of the tank. This early footage is from Neil's camera, and it will switch at a critical point. But we think this is what he's filming. He was filming himself, and there's a one-shot cut in of Neil and Bill at work. It's very brief and fleeting. They look extreme. There's Macbeth. They look extremely professional. This is down from Supreme Command. The incident is down Sri Ayutthaya Road towards Samsen Road, which is away from Royal Plaza where they have the trooping of the colour every year. That is the spot where things happen. The soldiers have just walked through. They're crossing to where the tanks are going to take up position soon. There are 2 tanks involved in the shooting. As you can see, deceptive. These are the tanks approaching. They had pictures of members of the royal family on the front. This is the king. Another one had the crown prince claiming allegiance to the monarchy, the usual pretext for a coup. But these are the 2 tanks that were really involved. I think that's a tuk-tuk. It's so Bangkok, motorbike ride. There they are. Okay, now this is where it starts, and Neil, this is Neil's camera. He's facing straight. Derek, you tell him. Yeah, straight into the camera, into the file, so it's going over his head. So you have these 2 tanks firing, and this one's turret particularly is moving backwards and forwards as they proceed to demolish the building. Shell fire.
this is raw footage without any correspondence narration.
So there's a lull at this point. It smokes out.
As I recall, that machine gun fire is when they were trying to hit the radio mast.
Something went very close then.
Yeah.
You can't, of course, see the left-hand tank because it's on the other side of this car that they're sheltering behind. And at this point you get the feeling that something's going wrong. Right, now the barrel of that tank had just swung in their direction and they've gone down. That's the impact that's probably on the wall behind them, and that's probably what did the most damage. So that's a shell coming from the tank on the right. And things have now gone wrong, very badly wrong. So somebody is pleading for them to stop firing, and we'll start waving a handkerchief in a second.
You're gone! Hãy subscribe cho kênh Ghiền Mì Gõ để không bỏ lỡ
Okay, the camera goes over at that point. And I think that's probably Bill Latch shouting what happens there. Yeah. Okay, then it becomes extremely confused. Thanks.
If I can try to explain what I thought happened here. We heard a lot of submachine gun fires, but I believe that, understand that the thing that killed Neil Davis was not any of those series of submachine gun fires. We also have heard about 5, 6, 7, 8 big bang, Those were cannons, cannon fires. The tank, the big cannon.
Which you've seen, yeah.
And a large piece of shrapnels, metal shrapnels, from one of those cannon fires.
This is Gary Burns, who's now dragging himself out from underneath Neil Davis, and that's what saved his life. We've lost the sound. The camera is now lying on its side, and what you're going to see is the very lifeless body of Neil being pulled away, and Latch is still alive following them.
That's Bill Latch walking.
Sorry,
crawling
Bill Latch.
through.
He's crawling, so he's still alive at this point. Just watch the piece of metal at the top of the frame. Something interesting happens in a second. There you go. That's a bullet, I think, and there's nobody there, but somebody put a bullet in at that point. All right, the film is about to cut to other footage, which is them being dragged away from the scene, so you'll see that in a minute. But this is Neil Davis's camera lying on its side. Okay, this is looking down the road. That's the front of the radio station, the green thing. This is Gary Burns pulling with the help of Thai photographers, and Bill Latch is following. Neil is quite clearly dead.
That particular scene was one of the things that made Gary Burns so angry, was Neil being covered with copies of Thai Wrath newspaper.
Okay, this is Bill Latch he's wounded on the side. They're removing him to the hospital. I think it was the Seventh-day Adventist.
It was a mission hospital or Adventist.
Adventist hospital.
Whatever it's called.
That's a photographer for Newsweek. I've forgotten what was the name?
It was Mission, I think. Because they kept amputating limbs to keep his blood pressure up.
So everybody's been caught out by this. Not a flak jacket in sight, of course, in those days.
Illegal, Dominic.
All right, so this is the tank. That's the primary tank. That's the one you saw on the right. It's coming back up now towards Royal Plaza, where the tank were brought back. They regrouped. They spent the rest of the morning and early afternoon there, refueled. And there was the prospect of a tank battle for the next 3 hours in central Bangkok. At about 11:30, there was a second bout of fighting when the government forces came and tried to reassert themselves. They pulled water carriers across the road to prevent the tanks moving around easily. But this would be about 10:35, 10:40 in the morning. That's the front of the station. Cameras, everything in position. It's where they hid. Absolutely devastated. Now you'll see a Thai journalist in a minute, Nick Devakun, who is in this group, who was with Agence France Presse at that time. And he actually went into the radio station after the shooting, and he believes there were 8 bodies on the floor and that they'd pulled the curtains down to cover them. But the official death toll that day was 5. So those would be 8 more, and they would be military people. That's Nick there, that's him, on the left. Yeah.
That was Gary Burns in the blue shirt.
So the tanks are pulled back at this point.
Okay.
Okay, to the mission hospital.
Jeffrey Luke there. Yeah. ABC.
ฝรั่งโดนยิง
How long after was this?
Well, this is the funeral at
Yeah,
Christchurch.
but a few days later, 1, 2, 3.
Well, the memorial service, sorry.
Yeah.
There was first this memorial service, followed by the cremation at the Wat out on Sukhumvit. His child, that was.
สวัสดีครับก่อนสวัสดีครับบ๊ายบาย
I think that might be the Bill Latch footage you're worried about.
ข้างไหน
Derek. She's Derek.
Yeah.
She's Neil's wife.
It's Judy.
'So just our Tit got back from Sweden the day after it all happened, basically. Prem got back on the evening, flew into Hajjai Airport and went down to see the king at the palace in the south. And Manun was put on a flight to Singapore at 7 p.m. on the day of the attempted coup. He was pushed out of the country to get him away, and he was sent off with 2 non-commissioned officers. Others who'd been involved in the coup had already given themselves up or had been implicated. They included his brother, who was with the Manat, who was a wing commander, General Kriangsak Chomanand, who was a former Prime Minister and was accused, and General Yot Tep Hasdin Ayutia. The general in whose name the coup was given claimed that he'd been coerced. It was General who was it? Yeah, Nanakon. He claimed that he'd been bamboozled into it.
What happened to Prajak? I know he's dead now, right?
He didn't take part in it.
He was with the Young Turks.
And, but the Young Turks are Class 7, and another prominent member is Chamlong Simuang, who refused to have any involvement with these coups and was in fact secretary to General Prem during this period. So it wasn't a fully class-supported coup. So the military attended the service to give their condolences. Of course, half the military weren't involved in the coup. They just put it down. More than half. That's, is that Brown? American future ambassador.
God is not a God of the dead, but of the living, for all who live unto him. For thee, O Lord, is the fountain of life, and thy light shall we see light. Please be seated for the reading of the 23rd Psalm. The Old Testament reading, and now a reading from the book of Revelation. Stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, and palm. The Lamb which is in the midst of the throne shall feed them. He shall lead them unto living fountains of waters. God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes.
Young Turks.
General Manager, Asia, NBC News. That stays here in the introduction.
Nick Beth? Beth, yep. Gary Burns.
I don't have any platitudes for you today.
That's Bruce McDonald, who is
Please
the
don't
NBC
anyone
bureau
tell
chief,
me,
Asian bureau chief from
isn't
Tokyo.
this just the way they would want to go out? It isn't. Foreign correspondents are not romantics. We're not heroes. We're realists. We know that this business is dangerous. We know it's probably the most dangerous profession around today.
Right, well that winds it up. We have a few photographs that were taken at Royal Plaza. If we could put those on, Eric, are you onto it? And whilst they're lining those up, the official casualties, as I said earlier, are in dispute, but it was two soldiers killed, Davis and Latch, and a lady, Vina, who was killed in a taxi on Samson Road. She was sitting in a taxi on the other side of a bus, and she had absolutely no idea that anything was going on. She thought she was in a traffic jam when this shell came straight through the bus. And that was one of the really appalling things of the day, was that it was so Bangkok as normal. There was a coup going on. There were tanks firing shells into buildings. They were firing shells up into the air that landed in Nonthaburi Market, which is many kilometres away. So people were walking around in markets and being hit by bits of shrapnel. The official wounded for the day was 62, of whom 27 were seriously hurt, seriously enough to be kept in hospital. I just want to briefly show you, these pictures were taken at Royal Plaza in the lull after the killing of Davis and Latch. They showed the tanks. That's the driver of the tank on the left that were shooting from behind the car. So, you know, we've got faces. Quickly forward, because it's just to show. Next picture. Same again, same tank. Next picture. You can quite clearly see the soldiers in profile. This was at the top of Sri Ayutthaya. The tank is pivoting to go into position, and everywhere you've got people looking, onlookers. It's just terrifying, and this has just happened literally 5 minutes before down the road. Okay, I think can we lighten the mood a bit and give Julian Spindler the microphone so that we can have a message from Tim Page. I think we need something. Can you give him, Eric, can you make sure he gets the microphone? It's hidden. Or come to...
Here he comes.
Go on, push me out.
I thought you were a retired tennis player.
Not retired. With all due respect to modern combat photographers, in a way, after looking at the footage this evening, it struck me that perhaps the Vietnam War was not only the first televised war, but perhaps the last. There was a sense of immediacy, a sense that the people who were bringing the images to the living rooms of Americans were putting themselves in harm's way, which I find probably lacking today when you have embedded press corps and that sort of thing. This is a message from Tim Page, who was obviously a very good friend of Neil. 1964. Mate, it was Vientiane, your first intro to the spatial world beyond the Aussie norm. The big O, opening the mind, and the start of a conversation that continues today. All that fucking war in between, all that hurt and sorrow and help for the survivors. A new cheerful bloke was there with the regular lunchtime obuse stringers, tousled, blonde, almost baby-like. Good day, in that strine twang and a firm handshake. I'm Neil, out of ABC, out of Singapore. Beers were consumed in the deck chair lounges on the monsoon ditch side of the patio. After that, Neil always paid for the first meal, and I always had a carton of Marlboro for him, as he didn't smoke. Later, after I arrived in Saigon, you were the guy I wanted to be, and your generosity with information, contacts, and tips was a rare thing in a world of competitive deadlines and many of us rushing to prove our worth. I always admired the way he shunned the ease of traveling with the Americans in their choppers, instead going out with the South Vietnamese, as it was their story, and the fact that he had stayed right to the end. 1985. Going back in 85, and then your hospitality, letting me stay with you in Bangkok, gave me the will to create 10 years after, which opened up the gates for the IMMF, the Indochina Media Memorial Foundation, and subsequently Requiem. It created the memorial upon which you would be writ. Your generosity has remained legendary, difficult to match and to continue. Your legacy still shines for all of us. You rightfully own a hallowed place in the history of our profession. I'm sure that there the memories tonight will produce some tears and lots of laughter, many glasses raised and cigarettes smoked in your honor. Thanks, mate. Miss you and wish I could be there.
Paisan, if I could ask you, as you were president of the FCCT in that terrible period, It was one of the most disruptive, appalling incidents that have ever occurred. You must have found it very challenging and hard to deal with. What are your memories of it?
Well, those were turbulent periods in Thailand, and we saw a lot of different types of conflicts, situations of conflict. And I suppose that we just did our job, try our best to cover the story as properly as we can. And as at the time I was president of the FCCT, and I think that we did try to inquire and demand for some explanation as to what actually went wrong, because it seems that there was some interpretation at the time that the tank was actually firing deliberately at the position of Neil Davis, Bill Latch, and Gary Burns. I mean, nobody knows for sure as to whether there was any deliberate intention to fire, to kill, foreign newsmen covering the event. I explained earlier that what happened was Neil and Bill Latch were not killed by the series of submachine gun fires. There were intermittent firing of the big cannon from the tank, one of the two tanks. And I think it was one of those cannon fires that hit the wall nearby where the three of them were taking position. If you all remember the footage, they were quite close by. I think they were near a public phone box, and one of the tank cannons hit the wall, and shrapnels bounced back, ricochet, you see, and hit Neil in the, I think his abdomen, left side, and cut open a big wound, and that killed him. We demanded for some explanation, but there wasn't any clear-cut explanation. And at the end of it, I think the event was taken over by many other, events. And in the end, there were, I think, about 40 people arrested, most of them the junior officers. The big boss, the big guy, of course, Manoon was sent on to exile, first to Singapore, and later on to West Germany. So, in the end, no one was held accountable, and not held accountable for the death of Neil Davis and Bill Latch. I think there were two other Thai civilians who were also killed. There were more than 40 other people who were injured in that particular failed coup attempt. And like many other such coups, successful and unsuccessful, I mean, the things got muddled over in a very, very unfortunate and very Thai style.
Right, well, if there's anybody who'd like to contribute a comment, there's a microphone, or should be a microphone. It's sort of been positioned for vertically challenged people. So if anybody wants to chip in something.
What's happened to Manoon? Yes, he's back in Thailand.
Manoon has been back. He was away in exile for many years. I think he came back in the probably in the early 90s. Now, for your information, that was not the first time that he staged a coup. Back in April, actually on April the 1st of 1981, Manoon, the leader of the Young Turks at the time, and Prajak Sawangchit, another prominent leader of the Young Turks, staged another coup, which became the famous, or rather the infamous April Fool's coup in Thailand. Also unsuccessful, because they tried to seize control and topple General Prem Tinsulanonda, who as many of us know, still enjoy strong support from the different institutions in this country, the armed forces leadership, the palace, and other influential elements in Thailand. So second time around, he didn't succeed. Again, I mean, many of you may ask as to why someone who has staged, two unsuccessful coup attempts to topple a legitimately installed government. I mean, in the old historical days, they'll be beheaded. Not just they themselves. I mean, in Thai we said, 7 ชั่วโคตร 9 generations. Their parents, their children, their grandparents who are still alive, 7 generations would be beheaded. And also those were, Thai historical days. But modern day Thai politics is quite convoluted, sad to say. And after a while, no matter how severe, I mean, your offenses are, in this case, a rebellion. I mean, the penalty is execution. After a while, you went into hiding, you went into exile, and somehow through your influential connections, you sought, and subsequently you got a pardon. And you came back, sort of as a free man. He's not the only one. No. I say this with a very heavy heart as a Thai. It's something which should not have happened in Thailand. I mean, coups should have been the thing of the past a long time. But then we had another coup a year ago. Before that, I mean, I didn't believe that there would be another coup. But somehow the fact that another coup happened last year underlies the fundamental fact, reality that somehow Thai politics is still quite unstable. That somehow there are still influential forces in the Thai society who don't get along, or trying to fight against each other, trying to gain control. And those who happen to be in position of influence, somehow in the end, they won. Even if they won against those, even if those who might have been elected democratically. So I think that tells the story of how, on the one side, how undeveloped or how underdeveloped the Thai political system has been, remains, and also how there have been attempts at the same time to try to develop the Thai society. So far, not very successful, but I suppose those forces maybe under the current now still continue to work. So what we don't see today, I suppose, are happening, below the surface, behind the scenes, and that the dynamism for change still continues.
Thanks, Faisal.
Jonathan.
I guess we're at a stage of making comments as much as asking questions, given the nature of the subject. Following up what Kumpai-san was saying, the last coup, I mean, I don't know if anybody here, I've lived through 2 coups, obviously some of you lived through many more. The one thing that always baffles me is how I never quite see the coups coming. When they actually arrive, the 2006 one, I couldn't quite believe it. The 2014 one happened while I was down at the Army headquarters, and I knew about it pretty quickly, but even then I couldn't quite believe it. I wonder if there's ever a stage you come where you actually do believe the coups when they're happening. But one comment that struck me very much after the last coup, when the military gave us their first briefing to the press, and one of my colleagues asked how long they'd been planning the coup for. And he looked at, it was Amy from Reuters, I think, who asked the question, and he said, oh, of course we didn't plan it. He said, that's treason. He said, you don't seem to understand how serious a coup is. He said, you launch a coup, if you plan it, that's treason. Treason, the punishment is execution. He was quite serious. This is General Chachalam, one of the senior members of the NCPO. He says, of course it wasn't planned at all. And she came back and said, well, you must have planned it a little bit. I mean, no, we just went and did it just like that. And this actually explains why I think Thailand's had so many constitutions, because every time they have a coup, they have to tear up the constitution, because under the constitution they've committed treason, so, they have to get rid of that straight away. And I think as we sit looking at Thailand, agonizing over whether a 20th or a 21st or whatever number it is constitution is going to solve its problems, and it clearly isn't. It seems to me that looking at this country, the biggest problem is you have a bunch of guys in uniform who still think they have an almost casual right to step in every time they don't think things are going well. And they would do well probably to take a lesson from Indonesia, which is a country where the military dominated as a matter of ideology. There was, up until the fall of Suharto in 1998, the Indonesian military had a role enshrined in their own doctrine to run the country. There was a parallel military administration right the way down to village level. And they've started to undo that. I wouldn't say the military will never intervene in Indonesia again. I don't think any journalist ever says never. But there has been the beginnings in a country that many times would argue is less developed than themselves, in the same neighborhood, that has unraveled one of the most deeply embedded military rules to pushing the military back to the barracks. The same has happened, interestingly, in Turkey as well. I wonder when Thais will realize that their problems are actually the freedom with which the men in green are allowed to play with politics rather than any number of constitutions.
Just before I take the next question, Manoon came back, changed his name to Manoon Krit, I think, or right. Manoon Rit, and ended up as president of the Senate under Thaksin. So, I mean, he not only came back, he was rehabilitated and is now a respectable old man. I was having dinner with Jonathan and a general about 3 weeks ago, and I asked him about class warfare in the military, and I said, you know, we had class 1. Prem is so old that he predates the class system. That's how old he is, whereas Chevrolet is class 1. And we were sort of going through all this, and I said, you know, what do you think? And he said, oh, no, we've changed. We don't behave like that anymore. Paisan, what do you think? Do you think the class warfare still goes on in the military, this intense jostling?
I think there's probably less disunity, less division, less factionalization in the army today compared to the bad old days. I have the intention to start a debate on the coups, you know, but I do have this to say that this last particular coup, I would say, was a little different from most previous coups. I sense that Prayut probably didn't really enjoy it. And if many of you would recall, that Thailand was under gridlock for more than half a year, since October of the previous year until the day of the coup, May the 22nd. So that's more than 7 months, 8 months. The country was under gridlock. Blame it on Suthep, yeah, if you like. Blame it on what's the name of Ying Lak. I mean, she's on the news anymore, so I forgot her name. So blame it on anyone you like, but the fact of the matter was, before the coup, this latest coup, Thailand was under gridlock. Couldn't move either left or right, front or rear. So when the coup took place last May 22nd, there was a big sign of relief, you know, by most people who care about this country, us Thais, I mean, or even, I would say, some foreign businessmen. Because that was the end of the gridlock. Because the coup allowed the country to move forward. You can say it's bad, you can say it's good. It depends on the where your standpoint, where you're talking from, you see. But this one, I think, was a little different from most previous coups. But
can I challenge just on that one point there?
I'm just going to finish now. For just one final comment that the guy, the officer, the general who said that, oh, we didn't plan anything, I think he was talking bullshit.
Yeah. The point to make is actually when Dominic and I were having this dinner with General Willett, we raised this point with him. We said, look, you know, rights and wrongs. There are no rights and wrongs. You know, there's bad on every side. But the difference with the coup last year was the gridlock you talk about was because the government was paralysed. The government, whether you like it or you don't, it was an elected government, was paralysed because the military refused to back them. And we made this point to General Willett, and he agreed. We said in 2008, 2 pro-Thaksin governments were brought down because the military refused to back them against very powerful, well-planned protesters. In 2013-14, the government failed because the military refused to back them and the police couldn't act on their own without the risk of a coup. In 2010, when the government was also beleaguered, the military risked its own reputation to use large amounts of gunfire to retain control of Bangkok against another insurgent movement, you could call it, on the streets. The fact is that the military has taken sides. The gridlock that the military solved last year was arguably created by refusing to back the elected government. The military has acted differently at different times. And actually, General Willat agreed, and he said, particularly in relation to the occupation of Suvarnabhumi Airport, he thought that the military had done the wrong thing then in not backing the government and allowing the protest movement to take over. So when you say, yes, it was a relief last year when the coup came, it certainly was gridlock, but it wasn't a gridlock the military had no responsibility for.
Okay.
Just very briefly, I mean...
Susan, get ready, and then you might get a question in if she's just... Anyway,
Well, I do not disagree that the military was taking side. I did mention earlier that the influential forces in this country, that would want to remain in power. So I mean, if they see that there are new developments which threaten their domination of power, either in front or behind the scenes, then they're bound to take side. And so I would not disagree with that.
Susan.
Thank you, Dominic. My name is Susan Walker, and I was here at that time as director of Handicap International, one of the NGOs working with the refugees, and also the coordinator with the coordinating body for the NGOs. And I was one of those saddened and shocked by Neil and Bill's death. I mean, as Kun Paisan said, they shouldn't have been killed, and we all felt that. I want to thank the FCCT tonight for remembering Neil and Bill. 30 years is a long time, and many people have forgotten them. I think those of us who were there will never forget them. I also want to thank the journalists who cover all of these stories, because you do put your lives at risk, and it really makes a difference. For us in the humanitarian world, the media is very important. We don't always agree with you, we'll have fights with you, but good journalists demand our respect, so thanks for that. Maybe one question, probably nobody can answer. They must have known who was in those tanks. I mean, they're on film. They know who was in the tanks. Why was no one ever charged? Is it because they couldn't tell who shot when, or was it a shell?
I think you'll find it's more a Thai thing of not wanting to find out who ordered. Yeah, I mean, I think we all know who ordered the tanks to open fire, but who was pulling the trigger? I mean, Kun Paisan can disagree with me, but I think nobody will ever be told who actually physically pulled the trigger.
There's only been one execution in relation to a coup, and it was in 1978, and it was a senior officer who shot a brother officer. What was his name?
Chalat.
Iran. Yeah. And he'd walked into some chap's office and said, "You've got to join the coup," and he refused. He'd shot him on the spot, and he was taken out and executed. And he had breached the code of conduct between officers. If you have a coup, you lose, you leave the country. Sant went to Burma in 1981. It's a long history of it. And you ask who should be punished. I mean, would you punish the guys sitting on the tanks following orders? They were ordered to do it. Or do you prosecute the people who ordered them to do it? What we do know is that they're completely identifiable, and they know who ordered them to do the shooting. And that's the only point of showing those pictures.
Everybody knows the numbers on those tanks. And they probably,
where they came from.
If you did the right investigations, you'd find out who was in the tanks, for sure. But that doesn't mean to say anyone's going to get punished.
But also,
it's a bit like a Thai traffic accident,
But also the lesson of 85 is that failed coups are actually far more dangerous than successful ones. I mean, when you have Suchinda just mop up to Chachai at the airport or whatever, it's bloodless. Ian.
Right, hi. Ian Hollingworth, retired member. Every year when I come to the FCCT AGM, I hear mention of the Davis and Latch Memorial Fund, and tonight I've learned a lot about the story behind it. I'm wondering if Dominic or maybe someone else can just flesh out what the purpose of that Memorial Fund is.
Right, well, we have 3 educational funds inside the FCCT. There's the Davis Latch Fund, there's the Georges Augibert Fund, which is older, which relates mainly to students in Thailand. The Davis Latch Fund is meant for more regional projects. For years it fell into disarray. It's now, those 2 funds are backed up by IMMF funds, Indochina Media Memorial Funds, which have been used for educating journalists throughout Southeast Asia. And the disbursements of the funds has been limited because the yield on the deposits has been very, very low. So we couldn't actually disburse anything significant without eating into the core amounts. But the funds are protected. They're never used for anything else except education. And this year the fund, the Davis Latch Fund, the IMMF Fund, various monies have gone into a Thai language manual for journalism that the IMMF produced some time ago, and that's being updated, and that will go out probably next year when we get around to printing it. The problem with the disbursements is finding worthwhile causes to contribute to, so we put money into things that are quite obscure, like the Isan Recorder, some newspaper up in the northeast, which seemed like a good idea. We've always put money into supporting students who are impoverished, and we're very aware that the amount that we can contribute is actually quite limited. I mean, the sort of sums that we kick out at the moment are sort of usually around 30,000 baht. But the funds are well protected. They've never, everybody who's looked after them has made sure that they don't go on beer mats or, you know, decent carpets or anything useful. They're kept for the purpose they were intended for. Paisan, you would have been involved in putting together the Davis Latch Fund originally.
Long time ago. Long time ago.
Yeah, can you remember?
I have no. I mean, I haven't followed up on the latest development, so I can't really say on the latest
but the background
situation. Yeah.
I should point out, and I think I'm correct, is that Bill Latch's widow and children moved to Colorado, where Bill's family lived. I know they were present at a memorial service held in New York by NBC at 30 Rock. But I think they're now settled in Colorado, and the kids must now be college age.
Right, well, I think I'd like to thank Paisan Sicharat Chanya. Did I make a complete mess of it?
No,
it was a near miss.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah. But I only get to do it once in the evening. It's too much like hard work.
You probably can't say Williams.
Derek and Klaus Bratt, thank you very much for coming. I'd also like to thank Neil Kelly, John Macbeth, Tim Page, and have I missed anybody?
Oh no, Gary Burns was going to contribute a YouTube thing, but he was working and he had to go down from Sydney down to Melbourne, and was not able to find the time, obviously, to send a YouTube video. But Gary left this country a very bitter and angry man, and I'm not surprised he didn't send anything.
Yeah, and I think it's very, very painful for him to revisit it, and we have to understand that. Yeah. And it changed the whole course of his life. I mean, he's worked as in sports journalism, hasn't he?
Well, now, when he first went back, he became a producer for the midday show for Channel 9, and now he's the head of sports for Fox Sports Australia. So he's done very well.
Anyway, thank you all for coming, and I hope you found it an interesting evening.